probably going to be a pretty austere year, which we haven't seen in a while. The projected deficit is now $9 billion. That's the worst since the Great Recession.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, we check in with our Capitol Correspondent about what New York State lawmakers will be up to this summer. New York State lawmakers have left Albany again, this time for good. The Assembly was back at the Capitol in mid-June to finish its work on a number of bills, and now lawmakers have returned to their districts for the rest of the year. In the coming months, Governor Kathy Hochul and fellow Democrats who control the legislature will start mapping out the next state session and budget, while also keeping a close eye on the 2024 campaign calendar. Joining us now for an update is Capitol Correspondent Karen DeWitt. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Ian.
I know we had a version of this conversation a few weeks before, but what did not get done in the second round of end-of-session votes?
Yeah, I hate to say that's probably the biggest news that came out of the Assembly's final two-day session was what they didn't do. I mean, first of all, they did do a clean slate, which would seal the criminal records for some people, so it'd be easier for them to get jobs and housing, that is after the convicted person has served out their term. But the Assembly rejected a whole host of more progressive and liberal bills passed in the state Senate, including one called Coverage for All. It would have extended health care for undocumented immigrants. Another would reduce plastic packaging by 50% over 12 years. It feels like this year the Assembly, which has more moderate suburban Democrats, has put the brakes on a lot of more liberal proposals. So that makes me think that they're looking for 2024 and they don't want to lose ground, but Democrats have supermajorities in the Senate and the Assembly, and I think they want to keep them. And right now they're in power and they're being kind of cautious. I mean, I guess that would be the word for the entire session. They didn't really break any new ground on any issues at all.
What about the question of housing? Everybody, it seems, ended up in a bad mood on that one as the session came to an end.
Yeah, that's right. Governor Hochul started off the year with the signature housing plan to build 800,000 units over the next 10 years. That housing plan was rejected in the budget for various reasons, including the Democrats in the Assembly and Senate wanted to put more tenants' rights in that Hochul didn't want to do. Hochul also had a proposal that would override local zoning laws to build housing, and that just... people in the suburbs just really hated that one, and the representatives rejected it. So that was out of the budget. And then in the final days of the session in early June, the Senate and Assembly proposed an alternative plan. But the governor didn't like that plan and rejected it. So they really ended up with nothing, which is a bit concerning because I think everybody knows that we have a pretty big housing crisis. There isn't enough housing, and it's not affordable. And it seems like the earliest they'll do anything on that is next year, 2024. That's a long time for people to wait.
Now, we've been watching Governor Hochul for a couple of summers now since she took office. Will she spend this period of time before lawmakers return kind of barnstorming that idea and others around the state? What do you expect to see from her?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not really sure what she's going to do next. So far, she's been kind of a hard person to figure out in terms of strategy. The end of the session, she wasn't even really all that involved. That's probably one of the reasons why the Assembly didn't do a lot of bills at the end of the session. She was out of town a lot. She's been highlighting a couple of things like an abortion rights measure that got passed at the end of the session. And, it's really, I really don't know what she's going to be doing this summer. She's, like I said, her strategy has not been that totally of a typical governor. Her poll numbers are in the 40s. Most politicians are not doing really well right now, but she just doesn't. She doesn't seem to be a polarizing figure, but I wouldn't say that she's a popular figure in New York State. But that said, we are entering kind of a quiet period after such a tumultuous period. I mean, don't forget it was almost 2 years ago when she replaced Governor Andrew Cuomo, who went down in flames in August of 2021. So, it might be a good thing that there's a little bit of a quiet period before they start gearing up for the next session.
Speaking of what's on the horizon, you've done some recent reporting about a potential budget crunch coming up, and that would be at a very interesting time in New York State, given the fact that the current state budget, which was about a month late, was a record-setting amount. So what are the expectations for the next round of budget making?
Well, that's right. It's probably going to be a pretty austere year, which we haven't seen in a while. The projected deficit is now $9 billion. That's the worst since the Great Recession, the days of former Governor David Paterson and the early days of Andrew Cuomo, where they had to make a lot of cuts. And Governor Hochul has said that there are storm clouds on the horizon, but she hasn't said too much about what she's going to do about it. It's also going to be difficult because 2024 is an election year for all the state assembly and Senate members, as well as congressional seats. So it's not really a good year to be cutting popular programs, raising taxes. So it really is not coming at a good time. But you could say they did it to themselves because they have been increasing spending at quite a record rate for the last few years. They had a lot of federal money during the pandemic, but that's dried up. But the programs that they started haven't completely dried up, so they're still trying to finance them.
Let's talk about literal storm clouds. In recent weeks, Governor Hochul has had several updates about the Canadian wildfire air pollution that has found its way to New York State. Put all of that in context for us. What is Governor Hochul and what are her state agencies saying about, what this portends for New York State?
Well, it's caught them like everybody by surprise. Nobody predicted that northern Quebec would be burning at such a crazy rate and that the smoke would be coming down here. And it seems like the first time that it happened, they were slow to react. It took 2 to 3 days before they realized, hey, the smoky air has settled in. And they've been issuing warnings with mixed results. I've kind of noticed just observing people outside on these smoky days that it seems like a lot of people after the pandemic are tired of restrictions, tired of government restrictions. They're going out anyway. But those particles are harmful. And if you have asthma or a heart condition, people have really experienced a lot of symptoms. But it doesn't seem like there's all that much that we can do about it other than spend the summer, part of the summer staying inside, which nobody wants to do. But yeah, it's like, a lot of the challenges that recent governors have had, and now Hochul are, climate change and unexpected events. And I think the best thing they can do is, put on that little jacket with the state seal and get in front of a podium and at least offer some leadership and act like they're in charge.
That was definitely an Andrew Cuomo mode, for sure.
That's right. And he was the first governor that really had so many things to deal with, like unusual hurricanes and floods and all of the things that happened. So, yeah, it is something that they're struggling with, I think, like everybody is as we see the climate changing.
Let me ask you now about Speaker Carl Heastie. This time of year usually brings his statewide tour when he visits different regions of New York, well outside of the Capitol in Albany. He has become really an Albany fixture since succeeding Speaker Silver. How is his standing nowadays?
Well, he is an Albany fixture to us and our listeners who pay attention, but I think he really flies under the radar screen, as Assembly speakers often do. He's somewhat accessible to the news media. We do talk to him every couple of weeks, though that said, at the end of the session, when they were rejecting all those bills, we didn't hear from him. I think he does pretty well. He has lengthy conferences with his members, so they all get to give their opinions. He doesn't act very autocratic about about anything he does. And I think in a lot of ways he does try to do what's best for his members. And right now he's seeing that it's best to just put on the brakes a little bit from the progressive, more liberal agenda, be a little bit more moderate, and just try to keep seats. I think they're worried about places like Long Island, Rockland County, some of the New York City suburbs, even some upstate areas where Republicans could make inroads. So I think that, he's trying to get out on these tours, maybe get a little bit of goodwill, maybe get a sense of what people are thinking in these areas so that he can better, fine-tune his agenda next year so he can keep the seats, because it really is all about keeping their supermajority next year.
Do you think the Democrats did enough in this legislative session to put the issue of crime and public safety behind them heading into the next election cycle? We know it was a real bugaboo for Governor Hochul and others lower on the ticket last election.
Well, the violent crime rate is finally starting to ease after that pandemic spike. So maybe it won't be as much of an issue. It really depends who the Republican candidates are and how much of an issue that they make of it. Because the reality is the crime rate is going down. But if you have a couple of big incidents, then it could, really not play as well for the Democrats. And I do think there are a lot of people just have a general sense of unease. And when they feel like that, they're open to, maybe having an alternative as their representative.
That's our Capitol Correspondent Karen DeWitt getting ready for the summer season in New York State government and politics. Karen, as always, thank you for taking all of the time to speak with us.
Sure. And just to add, I do intend to dig up some interesting stories this summer. It's not going to be boring for us.
Well, as they used to say in these parts, stay tuned.
Right.
All right, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.